Hey, what is going on everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Hope you are having a fantastic day. Now, if you're kind of like me and you've been writing a lot of darn Swift code for the last 3 or 5 years, you are probably able to notice a lot of repeated patterns inside of your application code base, right? And one of the most common areas that you'll find repeated code and a lot of copying and pasting is inside of the networking module of your application. So in today's video, I want to show you how to finally resolve this problem by introducing you to the idea of generics. Now, one thing I want to say about generics before I get started with some code is that the idea of generics is actually kind of advanced. It's one of the harder topics to learn inside of programming, so just make sure you kind of stick with me for the whole video and you should be able to understand it fairly well. So without further ado, let's get started here. And what exactly do I have on my screen besides Xcode on the left over here is the application that I have set up that pretty much does two things. It has two screens. One is the original course page right here, and upon clicking into one of these rows, we load some data regarding the course. So you see 4 items over here, and then finally you have 1 item for the last page. All right, so that is our very simple application that I wanted to go over. And basically we have 2 endpoints that kind of fetches the data that you're seeing inside of these 2 pages. So the first page is the courses, and you'll find that at this YouTube home feed endpoint. And basically videos array right here is these 3 items. So you see Instagram Firebase, you see intermediate training core data, and then finally Kindle basic training. And upon clicking into, let's say, this top item, we are going to hit this endpoint, which is YouTube course detail with the ID of 1, and you will see creating a registration screen and the duration over there. And all of these items inside of this array is reflected inside of this page over there. All right, so that looks pretty good, and hopefully you understand the problem we are trying to tackle. Basically, a lot of the applications that you write are going to have a lot of networking calls, and every time you create a new network call, something that you might do if you're not writing your code correctly is you'll just copy and paste all of the previous networking code and just modify a couple of different configuration parameters, and that's something that you would like to avoid, but it's kind of tricky on how you actually avoid that problem. So let me show you how to do that right now by moving the browser out of the way. And what I have set up on this Xcode project is something that's very simple. Let me just run it first to show you what it does. I believe we are just going to get a white screen. So that's the white screen over here, and we have some information being printed out inside of the console. So what exactly is this? Well, that is pretty much this first screen over here, and we are calling fetch home feed, which performs the fetch using the URL string of YouTube home feed, which is this first URL over there, YouTube home feed. And then we perform the data processing on line 29 using JSON decoder, which decodes this home feed object over here. And finally, we call the completion handler that takes in a home feed, and that's kind of how we print out everything using this line on line 17. So you see print $0 and name, and that's kind of how all this stuff works. Hopefully you are familiar with JSON decoder and how to use URL session, and that's kind of the setup work we have so far. All right, so let's kind of get into the meat and potatoes of today's lesson. And what I really want to show you is the problem that we are going to have whenever we try to make a second network call, which is this guy over here. So let's just copy this inside of our clipboard and move back into Xcode. So you see this screen right here, right? We click into this guy and we load a second view controller that fetches the second endpoint data. And typically when you want to create a second network call, you're just going to maybe copy and paste all of that. So why don't I do that and show you how this works. So you copy the fetch home feed network call. You see it has this URL string. You paste it right below or somewhere inside of your application. And what you do is you modify this guy and you say, you know, maybe fetch details or whatever you want to call it. And then you modify the URL string to be this second one over here, course detail ID equals 1. You copy that guy and then you change this URL over there. And then the last thing that you want to change is probably what you decode using the JSON decoder. And this guy is getting the home feed, so you obviously don't want to do that. Instead, you want to use something that represents this JSON data object. So what I have set up already inside of this project is the other object over here called course detail. It's going to have the name and duration properties so that I can sort of read in these two values over there. And so the last thing you want to do is to paste that course detail in there. And you want to change this to an array because the object inside of this screen right here is an array. And so you see it starts as an array like that. And there you go. So the last thing you want to do is you want to modify this over here so that it is actually a course detail array. So let me just copy and paste that in there because we are going to call the completion block using this object. All right, so home feed right here is a course detail array. So why don't we modify the name of this to be a little bit different so that it makes a little bit more sense. So course detail goes over there and completion with course details. All right, so paste that. And we are kind of ready to make a second call. So inside of view.load, I'm going to call fetch details, which we just wrote, and we have this completion block. We can say something like course details for our completion, and inside of here you can just say course details and execute a for each block on this object. And because it's an array, you can just say something like print and $0.name and maybe $0.duration as well. So let's just run this bit of code and hopefully you'll see this being printed out in the console below. So what you get is the original print statement of the home feed up there, and then we have the course detail name and duration showing up on the bottom over there second. So those are the two endpoints that we're trying to fetch data for, and you can imagine that if you have a third or fourth endpoint, you don't really want to copy and paste this stuff yet again because a lot of this stuff is just doing pretty much the same thing and it's a very generic in nature, right? And so here we go. This is where the idea of generics comes into play here. And the way that we are going to introduce generics is to make a third call. And down here, I want to say, let's say file private. And this third function, I'll just call it fetch generic, say generic data like that. And the thing that we want to do is to introduce this generic symbol called T. And again, this is kind of hard to understand at first until you have all the code written out. So I'm going to write down the rest of this using the same syntax that we kind of have up over there. So the completion block that we want to complete with is the actual T object over here, and this is the completion block syntax like so. All right, so this T object is the generic that we have inside of our fetch generic function call, and this T is kind of related to this T over there. And now let me show you how to actually use this stuff. All right, so I'm going to copy this code one more time and just pop that guy in there. All right. So the thing about this call is that it's going to complain about this completion block over here because this course detail, which is this guy, is trying to use this completion block of type T, and this guy is not of type T, and it's all very confusing. So what you really need to do to fix this problem is the object that you want to decode out, I'm just going to use T itself over there. And this guy over here, I'm just going to call obj. And let's just say completion block with obj, and everything should be fine. All right, the last thing that you need to do is you want to hit this fix button over here, which will introduce the @escaping over there. And there's going to be one last error that tells you that this T object does not conform to the decodable protocol. So the final fix is to make sure that your generic is actually a decodable like so. And if you build one last time, you'll see that this decode call, which takes in a decodable protocol, is actually working now. All right, so what can we do with this new method call of fetch generic data is we can actually replace this guy and just pop it in inside of view.load here. So I'm going to replace fetch details right now with that same call. So fetch details or fetch generic data, hit the enter over there. And for the decodable object, I'm going to use course details, and I have to actually declare what this type is so that the generic can actually automatically infer what your generic type is. So the generic in this function call is fetch is course detail, and inside of here you can do the exact same thing. So you can say course details. It shows you that this object is actually a course detail object, and it actually is an array. So you want to modify it to be an array like that. And again, if you just type it out, you see that it is an array type like so. And finally, you can say for each, and you can do the exact same thing that you had up here, and everything should work out fine. All right, so you can build your project and you can run your code, and hopefully the print statement that we had before will still show up like what we had earlier, and that's exactly what we get. The course detail object looks like it's being printed out correctly. And the last thing that we want to do with our fetch generic data call is that the URL string that we're using is only going to reach out to the course detail endpoint, which is the second guy, and we want to account for having different URL endpoints, right? So the last thing we want to modify here is, why don't we just introduce the URL string as a parameter inside of our function call. So let's say URL string and let that be of type string, and we can now comment that line out. This URL string property is going to take it from the parameter of this function call. All right, so the last thing you need to do is you want to modify that over here as well. So this is actually missing the URL string, so if I hit that fix, and I'll just pop that in there. And let me just grab that over here. So URL string, fetch details. So previously it was kind of using this thing over here. So let me just go back up here. For the URL string, you can just use quote, and I think I have the quote already. Pop that in there, and here we go. Fetch generic data is now going to take in the URL string automatically inside of its method parameters. And there we go, everything looks fine. All right, so now let me finish off by showing you how to actually refactor the fetch home feed into using this fetch generic data call as well. So what I want to do here is to say fetch generic data. The URL string is this over here for the fetch home feed. So why don't I just copy that? And for the completion block, hit enter. And again, you want to make sure that you declare what this type is by saying home feed type like that. And the generic call will automatically be able to infer what your generic type is, which is that guy over there. So over here, you can now say home feed. It appears with the home feed type, and you can say dot, let's see, videos. I'm looking up here, for each, and this guy is this statement. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to type that out correctly, so why don't I just copy and paste that in there. All right, so running one last time, you can see that your generic call, we will actually print out the exact same thing that we had before. All right, so with the introduction of the fetch generic data call, you can pretty much eliminate all of this unnecessary code right away. So what we end up with is just one single method called fetch generic data. It takes in a URL string parameter, and it has this generic type that automatically tells your JSON decoder what object to decode out of it. And then finally, your completion block will call with the proper object being decoded out. All right, so this is the way that generics work. The syntax, I have to admit, is a little bit confusing if you're just reading it for the first couple of times. So the last thing I want to mention here is that let's say we have a third endpoint that we want to consume data from, right? So at this endpoint, JSON decodable / courses, let me just copy that into my clipboard. And let's make a call to consume that data very, very simply by making a third call of fetch generic data using the endpoint of JSON decodable and courses. And for the decodable, let me just hit enter. And here we go. We have to now determine what the generic parameter of type T has to be, because it currently cannot infer what the generic is. So let me create that generic object right above that represents one of these objects over here. So we have ID, name, and link. And so this is a course object. So let me try to show you how that works. So let me just create a struct over here and call it course and make sure it conforms to decodable. Let's I think I had this as an int, and let's say name be a type string, and then we had the link of also type string. So those three properties are just these three things over there. And the last thing I need to do now is I need to just say courses and give this guy a type of array course like that. And the reason why I'm doing it inside of an array is because this is an array. If it's not an array, you can just specify the object itself. And inside of here, you can say courses.for each, and you can just print it out using print $0. And you can say, I don't know, link. Let's see, I think that's what it needs to be. Let me try to run that, and you should be able to see a bunch of links down in the description below. So these are the links right there, and because these calls happen asynchronously, sometimes the actual print statements occur in a different order, and that's kind of why you see this up here first. All right, so that's the power of generics, and using this fetch generic data call, you can kind of see how you can consolidate all of your networking code in just one simple function. And now that you have just one function, you can modify this guy to kind of handle a lot of other use cases. For example, we haven't really touched upon how to handle the error, right? So, you know, you can just type in here, let's say if let error equals that error object from URL session, you can print out, you know, failed to fetch data, and print out the error over there and just return. And so you can do whatever you want in here, and as long as you modified this one single function, you know that your changes will pretty much affect all of your networking calls so that you can see the error occur inside of your print statement or inside of your UI. Alrighty everyone, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on how to use generics to eliminate a lot of boilerplate code inside of your networking modules. And again, the idea of generics is definitely a more advanced topic inside of computer science and programming itself, so don't be too concerned if you don't understand everything right off the bat. Just make sure to pay a little bit more attention when you see this generic type of code. Alright, that's going to be it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button and also subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. If you enjoy what I do and want to support me, make sure to check out the courses down in the link descriptions below. And there's also going to be a link to the project that you saw in today's video as well. And that's going to be it for me today. Keep on coding, guys, and I'll see you in the very next video. Bye-bye.